Oh, I meant to do the theme song.
You can still do it, right?
Yeah.
Still do it?
Yeah.
It's my show.
A little backwards.
So getting back to how Mouse ruined comics.
Okay.
I like Mouse.
No, Mouse is fine.
There's 3 tiers of art. There's high art, there's pop art, and then there's low art.
Right.
And then there's Forces of Good and Evil.
Yeah. That is way down there. I will agree.
All right, 30 seconds. Your 30 seconds are up. No more boomer music.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, kids of all ages, it is the Mattriarchy. We are here once again on a Wednesday to talk about the thing that's most important to me. No. We're here to talk about comics. My goodness. What's wrong with me? What's going on? Hey, Mrs. H is here with the first. Appreciate that. May we be the first of many. Today we're actually here to talk about a topic that Larry wants to talk about. So maybe he can be in the top spot that's not me. Maybe that's how that should have worked.
Well, no. We should leave Twitless in the top spot because actually he has extra knowledge to bring to this game.
Oh, please don't put me. Please don't put those expectations on me. I will always let you down.
Don't let me down.
I mean, we are talking about something related to your academic discipline, so you should at least be able to put in some work in here.
I'll pretend. There we go. Like most good academics, I will pretend.
Should we start
Fake it till you make it.
Should we start selling Mattriarchy t-shirts that says Twitless? I'll always let you down.
Yeah. We'll sell a mint.
Over at the Gospel of Comics, we did a table read of the horrible Powerpuff Girls TV show script, and we're going to be making a Relapse Time t-shirt to commemorate that experience. Wow. But yeah, so
that was a masterclass in writing, by the way.
It was. So I came upon something as I was learning more about writing and learning more about why terrible people like Tom King do what they do to hurt, fictional characters.
I would like to say, for the sake of the show, the official stance of the show is that everyone is a terrible person, but some people do terrible things in addition to that. So Tom King is both. He does terrible things and is terrible.
Everyone is equal. It's just some people are more equal than others.
Yeah, I'm not sure he's more. I'm not sure he's more terrible than me, but he is terrible, and he does terrible things.
I mean,
he is pretty terrible.
I mean, Matt, I'm pretty sure if you were given the opportunity to write Batman, you wouldn't make Batman being a prolonged suicidal person seeking out a mommy to fulfill him.
Does he do that with like all of his runs? Because he didn't do that with Mr. Miracle too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he did.
And Adam Strange.
Yep.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Also, Adam Strange did a war crime.
Yeah.
Remember that? Adam Strange did a war crime
because he wasn't nursed long enough. Clearly.
I read the first issue and I said, "Yeah, this is going the usual route. I'm out."
Yeah.
So I came upon something called the literary theory of trauma, which takes from the Freudian tradition of psychoanalytic focus on trauma through Lacan, and it views trauma as a special thing that subverts language, subverts communication, subverts meaning, subverts memory, and in turn helps create individual identity through a convoluted process where national trauma helps form national identity, gender trauma helps form gender identity, and so on. Everything is terrible because everybody's feeling trauma. And instead of saying, well, okay, how do you deal with trauma? It's like, no, we want to focus on the trauma so that we can all relate to our shared common trauma.
Yeah, there's also some shared. I have noticed this. It's kind of indicative of a broader pattern that we see, I think, in literary criticism, which often focuses, I think, on some very negative things as kind of like the focus of the criticism. I'm just doing some other studies, and the amount of times where anxiety comes up as basically the thing to focus on, cultural anxiety as like, well, this is what is informing this literary movement, all this cultural anxiety, and it's not necessarily that these things don't exist, like, because anxiety does exist, cultural anxieties exist, they do exert an influence. Trauma exists, trauma does exert an influence. But I think one of the biggest issues, and this is something that people who do not come from academic backgrounds especially fault with the academic perspective, is the fact that it comes across like that's all what we're focusing on. It's almost like we're singularly focusing on trauma, anxiety, and all these things as what creates art. And to a layman, oftentimes this sounds kind of ridiculous, because although trauma and anxiety can in fact be what prompt art, it's not the only thing.
Mm-hmm. But let me just read from one of the academic sources that I pulled up here. A central claim of contemporary literary trauma theory asserts that trauma creates a speechless fright that divides or destroys identity. This serves as the basis for a larger argument that suggests identity is formed by the intergenerational transmission of trauma. However, a discursive dependence upon a single psychological theory of trauma produces a homogeneous interpretation of the diverse representations in the trauma novel and the interplay that occurs between language, experience, memory, and place.
You're giving me PTSD from my seminars.
There's a reason the classic expression goes, brevity is the soul of wit.
Yes, that's true. But Twitless, to be more specific here, you would have developed the post-traumatic stress after your seminars, and this is a recurrence of that. This
right,
would be
yeah, see,
right.
Yeah,
this wouldn't be the traumatic event. This would be reliving the traumatic event, like a kind of a trigger or a flashback.
It creates my identity from that. Yeah,
exactly. And it also, they speak of trauma, how trauma exists outside of linear time, which, of course, linear time is a construct of Western culture, and trauma flows both ways and is all consuming through time.
I'd like to see somebody put out a study to prove that works that works both ways through time.
Okay,
I'd like to read my grandmother's journal about the time I got kicked in the nuts really hard.
So there's a difference between what we call the hard sciences and the social sciences, and then what we call the humanities. And there's the burden of proof is very different for those three academic colleges, as it were. But in the
social sciences, you have to hand wave some things like these are totally real numbers that totally mean something. Honest, you guys.
Well, yeah, But the thing is that like time, to say that time, the linear time is a manufacturing of the West, well, you have to prove that. Like, I mean, you like time is measurable. Like it's a physical property of the universe. It falls into hard sciences.
So I would also bring up, and it's not a great.
Oh wait, wrong show. Sorry,
this is not the greatest time to bring up this particular thinker, but despite his many his faults that have come to light, Ravi Zacharias definitely pointed out some very interesting counterpoints to this whole idea that binaries are just Western, and in Eastern it's just multiplicity. And one of the things that he said that just really perfectly encapsulated this is he said, even in India, we look both ways before crossing the street. It is either me or the bus. So perfectly encapsulating the idea that like, it's not just like, binaries are a Western thing. And Ravi has, he had some exchanges where he just like shut some of that down. And it's like, yes, there is multiplicity in Eastern thought, but it's not just that. There are places where these binaries clearly exist. People in the East don't just live in some weird soup of just like, oh, everything is, completely relative. Like there are definitely some hard binaries that they still adhere to.
Yeah.
Or another great thinker, Mike Tyson, once said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Right. Well, I mean, and the other thing talking about like, the concept of, like it's only the Western world that deals with these sort of things. Okay. The knowledge that a dwarf star can only be so big, like it's called the Chandrasekhar limit. I'm going to guess the guy's name, but he was an Indian scientist who determined this. He's fully versed in numbers. He's fully versed in all of the Western ideas. Come on. The Arabic number system was not Arabic. It was invented by the Indians. The Arabs stole it. Not all of them, just some of them like 1,000 years ago. Let's be clear.
But how trauma theory ends up starting to seep its way into the discourse of comics, ironically, mouse is something that was mentioned in one of the articles, which made me smile a little bit when I heard reference to mouse being terrible in the opening credits.
Thank you, Evie, wherever you are.
is that it's used as a form of deconstruction. We use trauma not to deconstruct the hero as in trauma takes him down, but we use trauma to deconstruct the hero's identity.
Well, and I think I think that's an important distinction, because if you guys look at the thumbnail that I put together for the video, it's a scene from Batman 459 where Commissioner Gordon has a heart attack on like the second to last page of the comic. That's why I love comics the way that I do. Like I was kind of teasing around the edges of comics. I'd gotten a couple of Batman books. I'd gotten some DuckTales books. I was kind of digging the form, but man, when Commissioner Gordon like has that heart attack, that like hit me. Like that like set the hook, and it's been stuck in my mouth for 20, 30 years. 30 years now. And so I think that there's a point where like, this was, Commissioner Gordon had to deal, and by proxy, Batman had to deal with the trauma of his own bad life choices. But that was a thing that, that was the drama that kept me on the hook until, later on in the year and everything else. But so I think that there's a place for traumatic events within stories.
Right.
The question is what is the function? What is the purpose of that?
But trauma theory is actually using trauma in an entirely different way than that. The way you're using trauma is the way people actually experience trauma in their lives. Trauma theory is saying that trauma creates harm to people, and that harm is something they can't communicate to you, but you just have to accept it. And that harm leads to them doing things that seem inexplicable to you, but are perfectly explicable to them.
So before we get further into this, and I definitely wanted to prompt you on some more thoughts there, Larry. We do have some good engagement from chat already.
Yes,
Dave
Nebel's got the thinker on. Way to go, man.
Dave says time may change me, but I can't change time. Put that on. We have some fortune cookie writing going on already.
That's very insightful.
Yeah. Nebel Helm says, if that's true of trauma, isn't that true of literally any emotion you experience that has a profound effect on you?
Yes.
The idea that trauma transcends time because you can experience it outside of the original moment. And he says, howdy, I'm already rambling, hitting the ground running. So excellent. Good. You're in the right place. But
absolutely.
But yeah, to kind of like maybe start drawing some demarcations that will be helpful here, so we don't get too lost in the weeds as we just about did talking about dwarf stars, and I don't know how we got on that, but
we were just talking about the concept of scientific applicability across culture.
I know. I'm just, welcome to the Mattriarchy.
I just draw pictures. You guys lost me a while ago.
We're going to be all over the cosmos tonight.
Well, because here's the thing is like Twitless and I have talked about this this is a slight sidetrack. I have this crazy theory that I think that all knowledge is connected, right?
Yes.
And the artistic principles that govern the aesthetic sense are related. They're not the same, but they are related to the philosophic concepts that inform the scientific method that allow us to experience the physical world. So our ability to understand the emotional world and our ability to understand the physical world are connected as part of a great tapestry of existence. But
So setting aside the unitary philosophy of the cosmos,
but
Yeah, that thing.
they're not the same tools, they're related tools. And so when we're talking about these sort of ideas, the scientific applicability is there, but that's not necessarily what we're actually trying to get at. So
So when it comes to trauma theory, because this is something that I'd like to prompt Larry on a bit, because he's done more research into this specific theory. What's interesting is the fact that in superhero comics specifically, there is a point that's been kind of teased with some of the trauma theory readings you've been mentioning, and the fact that trauma creating identity, and that is accurate to an extent in superhero comics in many cases. We have Superman has Krypton blowing up definitely plays a formative aspect in his identity. Spider-Man and Batman are probably really important. Spider-Man,
Daredevil.
I was in Spider-Man, it's so profound because it's in his first appearance, and those panels where you see Peter just like literally reacting to trauma, and that becoming literally one of the major kind of pivotal points in I Will Be a Hero. And so
also for Spider-Man, before the first page even comes out, there's the fact that he's being raised by an elderly aunt and uncle, which is another level of trauma as well for the Spider-Man character.
Yeah, it can be. It sets up that he doesn't have the ideal home environment,
and it's his aunt and uncle, which implies lost parents as well. So I would definitely say that there is something to this idea in trauma creating identity, and that's specifically applying to superheroes. However, there's a specific difference between the classical usage of trauma creating superhero identity and what we eventually see in the Bronze Age and the deconstructionist movements in comics. Some of the stuff we see maybe in Alan Moore and some of the British Invasion, Warren Ellis gag. I hate Warren Ellis, by the way. Sorry if that bothers you.
No. I thought you guys really are you okay.
And then specifically with the person we've been picking on lately, Tom King, who, if you don't know, he was the one who was behind, if any of you bought the big was it Batman number 50, the wedding issue? That was a total rug pull that people had visceral reactions and led to Tom King's 100 issue run being cut short, I believe.
And the first time in actual Batman history where sales plummeted and never got back up until 50 issues later.
Yeah.
Oh, I was not familiar with that exact.
Yeah, actually they had been down, and then James Robinson came on for I think it was was that Detective? It may have been him.
That was
Detective. Yeah,
that was the first time Detective actually started doing better numbers.
It may have been Tinian. I can't remember. Somebody came on to do a short run, and it was started climbing again.
Yeah, it was bad.
But,
we have Ichthus saying, "Hey, Rhys rocking the Amish beard."
when you don't shave for a year, that's what happens.
But also, Tom King's exposure to trauma theory is more on point because Tom King was open about going through psychological help for some issues he had, and not being a fan of mental health therapy, and he uses a lot of that language in there.
Yeah.
And Flashpoint. What was the one where he ruined Wally West's character?
Oh.
Heroes in Crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was basically in part, I'm not going to say I know exactly what Tom King was doing, but he was basically saying, listen, therapists couldn't help me, so they can't help Wally West. But I mean, if that's the read on Tom King, that means that Tom King was contemplating killing a whole bunch of people accidentally.
Well, he was part of the CIA, so there might be some stuff
He's probably
I mean, again, Adam Strange committing a war crime. That makes me feel very uncomfortable reading that from Tom King, knowing
There's
Tom
been
King's
a lot of self-insert in
history.
comics lately.
Yeah.
So one way that I would draw the line between someone who kind of who uses trauma theory differently than classical usage, if I were to kind of think about that, is the fact that trauma definitely exists in the identity creation of many of our classic superheroes. Not all, but in many. But while it does form an important point, it is important because it serves a narrative function, and it's very clear it often serves that narrative function in terms of story.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily meant. It's not like you pick up Spider-Man and it's like you don't necessarily pick up Spider-Man to be like, I need some therapy. I'm going to pick up Spider-Man and have Spider-Man therapy me. It's basically, this is escapist entertainment, and the trauma is used as a narrative tool. So that's the first point that I think is different. And the second is the fact that Spider-Man, although he still deals with it as a point of narrative, significance, it's not like Spider-Man is ever supposed to be totally immersed in. This is a tough one because Spider-Man goes through several traumas over the run. He goes, we've got Uncle Ben, you got Gwen, you've got Captain Stacy, so he does have quite a lot of them continue to happen. But I would say that the point of Spider-Man isn't to dive into psychological trauma as much as these traumas exist as narrative elements to propel a story. And there seems to be, I think, a subtle but significant line where you either use traumatic experiences to propel your characters forward in a narrative, or whether you immerse them in them to the point of it just being like a quagmire of just misery for almost misery's sake.
Yeah.
And that's really I think that's part
Let me actually interject with the term from within trauma theory as a study for literature.
Mm-hmm.
The term trauma novel refers to a work of fiction that conveys profound loss or intense fear on individual or collective levels. A defining feature of the trauma novel is the transformation of the self ignited by an external, often terrifying experience which illuminates the process of coming to terms with the dynamics of memory that inform the new perceptions of self and the world.
So what you're saying is basically Tom, as opposed to what we've seen previously, Tom King's approach and people like him is to turn superheroes into trauma novels specifically, because that sounds kind of consistent with kind of his approach.
Right.
So it's opposed to using trauma narratively as opposed to creating trauma novels, which is it's a genre and people can enjoy them as they will. But one thing that I will say is the fact that it's important to understand that the superhero genre is its own genre. And if you change the genre too much, it becomes a different genre.
Yes.
So it sounds to me that people like Tom King basically, and this is something that we've seen in other deconstructive authors at times, where it's like, this is not the superhero story that I either expected or grew up with or want. I'm reading something else.
And even Adam Strange, which is not truly a superhero story, right? Adam Strange it's the same kind of adventure as John Carter from Mars.
Right.
There's shades of the superhero, the exceptional outsider who comes to new society and steps into it. It's The Last Samurai. It's Fern Gully. It's
Dances with Wolves.
Dances with Wolves. The main difference is that it's Buck Rogers, right? There's that element in there. Ooh.
For anybody who is familiar, my Anglophiles.
Yeah. But yeah. So that's but with that, one of the elements of the hero literature story is that you never let the bastards get you down, right? The idea that victory, that conquering, over the obstacle. Is whether that's external forces, or whether that's the enemy, whether that's some animal in the wild, whether that's our own corruption, whatever it is, that victory is the point of the superhero story, of all hero stories.
And the superhero story comes more out of the Jungian framework of psychoanalysis, which Jung deals with the psyche and the mind more almost as a supernatural force.
Yeah, he does with the archetypes.
Right, and I mean, and a lot of that's because like Jung himself was not the originator of some of those ideas. Those ideas are extant within the culture, within hero literature, going back to Greek and Roman times, going back to Gilgamesh to a certain extent. Those ideas necessarily entirely fleshed out in that way, but the idea of the conquering hero.
Neville's got a good point. That sounds like the difference is that the older use of trauma forming a heroic identity is that it's more a call to action rather than an all-consuming pathology. That's very well put.
Yeah, the idea of Bruce Wayne, as written when I was a child, is Bruce Wayne suffered, so he made a determination to, as much as is possible, to keep anyone else from suffering.
As
Which
a
you could
counterpoint,
almost-
okay.
I was gonna say, which you could almost say, Tom King then retroactively saw that through and said, instead of Batman suffering made everyone else pay, Tom King said, "I suffer so that everyone else will suffer."
There you go. I would argue it is interesting to bring up. I almost feel like
Good call.
I almost feel that Tom King, maybe if you were to hand him a superhero, they should have handed him Peter Parker. Because like if anyone is familiar with like is Spider-Man Blue, which is like essentially a trauma novel, right?
Yeah,
a trauma graphic novel. And so like Spider-Man is definitely, I think that in terms of what you were previously outlining there, Larry, I would say Spider-Man probably flirts the most with the trauma novel as a genre. Depending on, especially there was some definitely moments where it's just like, yeah, they were definitely.
Well, I mean, to add on to that, when years and years ago, my buddy Chris and I were sitting around chatting about Spider-Man movies, and he just hated Spider-Man 2. And I'm like,
really?
why did you hate Spider-Man 2? He said it's just Peter Parker's crappy life. And I said, have you never read a Spider-Man comic?
Yeah, right. Hello, let me introduce you to this character.
Well, and that's Chris wanted. He wanted to see that heroic journey first off, and I mean, Raimi was kind of saving that for the third movie, and he kind of botched it or whatever. But Peter Parker's ultimate triumph takes longer, and I think that was Raimi was building toward that. But Chris was like, "Oh, we should see that here." It's just this is everything's just terrible.
But Dan mentioned Beowulf in the comments, and they actually refer to Beowulf, the people in trauma studies for literature. They tend to view that as like an archetypical classical trauma novel. Because if you view it from their perspective, it's about Beowulf's traumatic exposure with Grendel, how that trauma then in turn leads to him being the tired, broken down king who goes up and faces the dragon and dies.
So my issue with some of these theories is the fact that a lot of times I feel like they can be you're forcing a square peg down a round hole.
Yeah.
Or pleading.
And there's several theories where it's like, I don't know how well this one fits. Because some of them actually, again, they do have some merit. Like I said, as we just earlier discussed, trauma does have a large impact upon the creation of superhero identities in many cases. But there are places where it's like, I don't know if it's fitting here. Or does it fit as well?
Well, and I think one of the things with Beowulf, and the brokenness of Beowulf in between parts 2 and parts 3, I personally, my take on it is it has less to do with it suffering some trauma in its own sake, and the fact that like the second part of Beowulf is really in some ways, maybe I interpret it this way anyway, as he got some comeuppance for his braggadocio in the first part.
If I'm being honest, they should have used Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh has a much stronger link to trauma theory than Beowulf does.
Yeah, I would agree.
Gilgamesh, like towards the end, is literally just about I've lost my best friend, and this trauma has completely eradicated my identity, and I'm
it's my fault. And that's the other thing about Gilgamesh. It's my fault. I sent him because I didn't. He lacked a certain level of boldness.
But trauma theory actually doesn't want to put culpability and responsibility. It wants it to be vague so that you, the reader, have to question whether you can believe that someone is actually culpable and responsible for their own actions.
And that would be one of the reasons that I would vastly, yes, you do suffer from the choices of other people, but how sometimes the way you suffer comes down to your choices with dealing with it. And that's something I think that like people are not too friendly to think about how we can take control of that ourselves.
So the thing with a lot of modern theories is they play very most postmodern theories that I have seen are obsessed and completely dominated by assumptions of power. It's a lot of it's informed by German.
A Marxist Hegelian framework on power.
Well, not just Marx, because you get a lot of Foucault.
Well, no, Foucault comes from the Marxist tree, but it all goes back to Hegel and Hegel's dialectical view of the universe.
But yeah, you get like the Frankfurt school, you get the French school of it, which, as you mentioned, they're connected in ways. And in modern terms, you get, like I said, you get Foucault cited a lot. And for those of you in chat, Foucault was a part of a bunch of French, what I'll call French weirdos. That's me being generous. Because you can actually look. I recently found out how much of that French school in particular were just creepy weirdos, and I think it was Foucault himself who was recently cited as like
a pederast or a pedophile.
I'm going to go with pederast, or at least accused of it.
For the layman here, could you explain the difference there?
So pedophiles want sex with a child who's under the age of sexual maturity.
Yeah, that part I get.
Pederasts want sex with a child that's over the age of sexual maturity but under the age of legal authority.
Yeah, so it's
just creepy all around.
They're creepy French weirdos. And it was so funny because I actually had this moment where I was discussing these with a scholar, and the scholar was saying, there's some problematic, because the whole Dr. Seuss kerfuffle, right? Dr. Seuss is a problem now, whatever. And people are starting to have these debates about, do we remove these people from literary canon because they're a problem? And I was like, okay, so if we're going to remove Dr. Seuss because, he's a problem, let's talk about Foucault for a second. Do we get to remove Foucault as well? And it was so funny because I brought this up, and the scholar in question who was mentioning these things was kind of he didn't have an answer for me because of the double standard being raised of, if we remove one person for being problematic and racist or whatever, we should probably also consider removing the pederasts. So,
and the irony is Foucault is very much the political philosopher that best explains what we've been going through the last year, almost 2 years now. And it's really...
You mean like Panopticon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The Panopticon, and also bioregulation and biopower.
So before we go too far in the weeds there, Panopticons are an interesting concept, and it's basically a surveillance state, essentially.
Okay. It's not just a surveillance state.
Together, and
right. I just for our purposes, it's probably,
the all-seeing eye? Is that what we're saying here?
Pretty much,
No. So
kind of.
Panopticon was originally a concept that comes from Hume that was talking about a way to design a prison so the prisoner felt they were always observed.
Right. So
and that observation molded their behavior.
So kind of like being a parent?
So you have the idea of you put a prisoner in the middle of the prison, and there's the guard towers, and so there's nowhere he can go where he's not observed. For the more layman understanding, Rhys, yes, it's all-seeing eye in a sense. It's more like all-seeing eyes, plural, and you're in the middle of a prison.
But you might have also seen it in a little story called 1984 by George Orwell, and another story called A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Both of them are describing Panopticon-based dystopias. Basically, every dystopia you think of has Panopticonic features in it.
Or Google.
Right.
Yeah.
I would say 1984 probably has more Panopticon than Brave New World. Well,
yeah, but they both do, but it's more obvious in 1984. It's more out front.
Dave says, I thought Panopticon was a transformer. Probably would make a good one.
So another aspect of the whole weirdness around trauma studies is how it connects into intersectionality. That if you're black, your blackness in a white predominant society is fundamentally traumatic. And thus, the black character under the lens of trauma studies can be heroic because his trauma allows him.
So this is where the concept of forward and backwards in time becomes very significant.
Yeah.
Because when it applies to racial instances, this is where someone who has no direct experience with, for example, slavery, can in fact ascribe their trauma to literally, like, chronologically anywhere in time. So that is a significant line that is drawn in some of these cases.
Yes. And also, in turn, it allows them to be heroic because, due to their traumatic status, they are outside of the corrupted world that causes the trauma. That's in turn why you're seeing a big trend towards disabled characters being in the mix with mainstream heroes, because that disability gives them access to the heroic space in this altered version of trauma theory literature, because they're not normal. They're not part of the normal corrupt society that oppresses.
And yet they've in comics they've done the yeoman's work, so to speak, to take all the really cool disabled characters and unspecial them.
Yes.
Downplaying them.
They've gone out of their way to water down and otherwise dilute the best and coolest disabled characters. And I don't mean that as any kind of like, I mean, Oracle, let's just face it. Part of the strength of Barbara Gordon's character in the wheelchair, her indomitable spirit, right, made her a stronger. And I wrote about this on the blog, on my blog at idealcomics.net way back in the day. I'm not sure if it's gotten reposted or not, but the strength of character that Barbara had to have gone through the Killing Joke, to have been confined to her chair, and to rise again in Phoenix, like, for crying out loud. She was a stronger, better, more noble character than she ever could have been as Batgirl.
What do you guys think about them kind of retroactively going back on that and taking away that status with the current version that they're running?
I'm kind of okay with it, if I'm honest. I like Oracle as a character. I also like regular Batgirl. I like them both. So if I'm being honest, I actually like a narrative space where both can exist, like two continuities essentially. I loved Batgirl running around in, the animated series, just being Batgirl. She's a fun character. I enjoy her. I also like Oracle. I like them both. It's hard for me to personally say that I would pick one and say that the other can't exist.
Well, I mean, I could say both can exist as part of a continuity of that evil linear time that we keep talking about. Because, going through that idealistic young phase, going through a tragedy, becoming stronger than you were before, that's a pretty powerful story. It's a story a lot of people have to live through. But to go say, oh, I've made all of this internal growth and I've become such a stronger, better person than I was, and I've been able to overcome. I have this internal strength, and now none of that matters because I can go back to having my legs and being a vapid 20-something.
You just hate retcons.
But
I don't. I
hate bad retcons.
I hate bad retcons. Yes.
But in my opinion, this influences why Jane Foster Thor didn't get her cancer cured before she became Thor or during her Thor era, is because that would remove her from this traumatic continuity space of being a cancer survivor / person struggling with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And also, when exactly did Killing Joke come out?
87.
87. So Killing Joke came out 9 years before the first academic person sort of, before the first person to make the major academic volley in trauma theory, which was 1996.
Okay.
Also, again, as you're swapping genders, you're swapping races, this is bringing trauma into the heroic mantle. The same thing happens with sexuality. But what's fascinating is we don't see the black character experience trauma unless it's so cartoonish as in it doesn't make any sense to the lived experience of any person.
Well, I mean, that comes into when Bendis was writing the Iron Man stories with Riri Williams, which what editor looked at that name and said, yeah, let's go with that. No one will ever make fun of her name.
Someone that didn't have any say in power.
Oh my god. Anyway, but when they went through that and basically wrote her origin story, being that she wasn't oppressed enough.
So
that her that I mean.
So
like,
this
like,
is, and I'm not gonna argue for this because some of these theories, like I said, they make me roll my eyes internally and cringe until I die. But I will say that they're often a litmus test for in rhetoric what we call your warrants, which is basically your inborn assumptions, the assumptions that you bring to the table without even knowing that you bring them, and they basically represent your worldview. And when I mentioned before about a lot of those postmodern, Frankfurt School, French school people, they saw the world in these, very differently than you and I see it. And it's influenced by, certain philosophers like Hegel and some others. Heidegger, I think sometimes Bourdieu, so some others, again, more French and German names. But basically a lot of it, again, boils down to, materialism, a very material view of the world, and a very power-oriented view of the world. And if you view the world as in purely material and power-related terms, you really can't help but see things very differently than someone who sees the world in a far less material way.
I would argue that if you were serious about looking at the world as a purely materialistic thing, then power doesn't exist.
I mean,
No,
that would be
Because power is an immaterial. Power is an immaterial thing.
No, being material doesn't mean that you're ignorant of thought and concepts. It means that what matters in terms of how you interpret things is going to be their material impact.
No. What Matt's actually arguing for is almost like a Stirnerian argument about the ego being the only thing that matters, and the ego is what drives property, what manipulates the material.
I've heard it said that it all really just boils down to whether you're with Plato or whether you're with I think Plato or Aristotle or something. Which it's you can take a lot of this back to some very, very old philosophical concepts, but to bring it back down to kind of what we're talking about, when it comes to a realistic or unrealistic depiction of oppression and therefore trauma, right? For those of us who see things the way we see them, we look at okay, here's a character, they're fairly privileged, like Riri Williams. How could she be oppressed? What Larry's kind of bringing up with this trauma theory and its connections to some of these broader postmodern and Marxist, a lot of the Marxist movements, is the idea that your entire existence is kind of a whether you see it or not. So it doesn't matter if you deny it or not, but your entire existence is predetermined by trauma and power, by these forces, essentially. So the fact that Riri Williams exists in a culture that is our current culture, she's automatically oppressed. It doesn't matter if she's rich. It doesn't matter if she says that she's not oppressed. According to this worldview, her existence is oppression. It cannot otherwise be.
Right.
I got a question.
Follow this back though. Okay. So if Riri, and in the story, she's middle class, single parent family. They're not, things aren't easy, but things aren't you're not living in a gutter either, right? But
tell me I can't be an astronaut. Well, there's already been a black astronaut and a woman.
You absolutely, exactly. That was the thing, is tell me I can't. No, of course you can. Why couldn't you? I can't believe the thing. But the thing is, what I'm saying, so she lives in a world where she's by default an oppressor, right? Then you take that back a generation, and then her parents, and infinite regression, right? Right. You go all the way back. Then there can't be an oppressor or oppressed, because everybody can only do what they can do. There's no option to make choices. There's no free will when you play that back to the very beginning of stuff. So there's only this. And so there's no moral weight because there's no choice in the matter. So no, your position is to be this. Then that's just the station you need to exist in.
Well, these people get into very weird philosophical arguments on time about how the past doesn't exist, the future doesn't exist, and technically the present doesn't exist.
Well, then there can't be inherited trauma because the past doesn't exist.
No, have you ever seen a postmodernist try to have their cake and eat it too? Because
they can.
They totally do. And pointing out a contradiction in some of these theories is not enough to, at least in their worldview, undermine their position. Because, like I said, if it was simply a matter of I found a contradiction,
because the real irony of critical theory is that critical theory is only about being critical. It's not about critically thinking. It's all of this stuff is about pointing holes in other things, not about having anything sustainable.
I will say that is definitely a tendency that I have unfortunately noticed a lot myself recently. Is that a lot of critical theory is very good at deconstruction and very poor at construction. I've been in seminars before where I simply asked this one question. Hey, these are some very interesting critiques. Can you offer me a system by which your principles can be realized? And I got like dead silence. So like it was very interesting because it was like, and there was even some admission. Oh yeah, we don't have a method that we could actually resolve any of these issues. We just need to continue pointing out the problems so that we can. And this is where one of the fun parts of reading these types of theories is this is when they start getting very abstract and wishy-washy with their vocabulary. They'll say things like, this is how we anticipate a utopian moment. This is how we can imagine potentialities that will address equality and further realize...
Wait. So you imagine something that might exist but doesn't acknowledge...
Let me read you some of that wishy-washy stuff. Trauma theory denotes a vibrant interdisciplinary area of Western scholarship developed since the 1980s through cross-fertilization between psychology and the humanities. The incorporation of trauma theory into film and media studies realized in relation to the field-shaping influence of psychoanalytical informed film theory has enabled a fuller explication of the power and complexity of the relationships among calamitous historical events, media objects, and networks, spectator positioning, and mental processes.
What?
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, I will say that there
is meaning that is hidden in there.
Yeah.
But this is written for somebody to get their thesis in that.
But the words are designed in such a way as to obfuscate the meaning so that you don't ask questions.
I would agree with some of that. I will say that there are some theories that do some of that I actually do respect, and that's I read some of this for Rhys when I was reading some Thierry Gronstein, which was comic book structuralism. But in that case, he was dealing with the material components that create what we see on the page. And in that case, getting a little bit lost in the terminology was fun because at the end of the day, there was in fact something to find that we were trying to find. And it was something you could pinpoint in an actual material way, which is funny.
Right, exactly. We're using these concepts about structure to discuss physical structures.
Yeah.
Now,
right. And the way that the human attention interacts with these, because that's one of the fun things about comics as a visual form, is that the writer and the artist work together to try to evoke emotions and thought processes in a particular order to the reader who isn't there. So there's this remote relationship that's in between words and pictures, and that we use that to, and just like a novelist does, uses words alone to evoke certain things in the reader and to cause something in their mind to react to it.
So let me actually reference something referring to Mouse again, referring to how the art communicates the trauma. And the most unimaginable scenes from the camps, a family friends hanging, a baby thrown against the wall, sometimes aren't drawn at all. Spiegelman covers the worst images with talk bubbles that prevent us from seeing the full horror of what happened. I can't begin to imagine what it felt like, Artie admits about the camps, and the inability Spiegelman makes literal with drawing that occludes itself. In the end, Spiegelman's narration suggests that it's the telling of the trauma story, talk bubbles, the fraught authorial decisions about metaphor, Vladek's meandering testimony that paradoxically enables the narrative and obscures it. You see how I have to suffer, Vladek asks his son at one point, referencing not insignificantly his troubles with glaucoma and cataract. The thing is, Artie doesn't see, not completely nor adequately, because the suffering on the scale is impossible to witness. The genius of
Go ahead.
the genius of Mouse lies in the many ways Spiegelman passes the impossibility on to us.
That's actually a good point. So there's what I like is the fact that the theory that's being applied here, when it is in fact paired with some solid structural, this is something I do find that's important when we're dealing with theories, because a theory is an idea. But that's why we talk about theory and practice, theory and praxis, which is the theory and application. If you can take your theory and apply it to a direct example, it gives that theory a lot more credence. So the fact that we can actually see some of these things operating in a trauma text and through some of those structural elements actually does add to the interpretation. It adds some depth to it. And there's some excellent points being made there, because you do have the depiction versus the obfuscation in that example in Mouse. That's a good application. It's where we get into the weeds with some of these applications, or when I would say those applications are put in round, again, square peg, round hole. When you take the trauma novel and you shoehorn it into Batman, you get Tom King's Batman, and you get a lot of people who are not resonating with it and they hate it because because the reason why they show up to Batman. And I'll give a good counter example to this, right? When you go to your local library and you see the wall of cheap romance novels, and they all have like the bare-chested guy and the swooning dame.
It's me.
Yeah, it's Rhys. It's Rhys without a shirt. Imagine that. Everybody imagine that right now. As you guys are imbricating that idea, the women who pick up those novels...
Wait, give a little bit for everybody to come back from retching.
Yeah, or swooning.
Smolder.
The women who go for that genre are there for particular reasons, and they want a particular story. And I'm not judging it. I'm just saying that's what they're there for. And when people pick up Batman, they're there for a particular reason. It doesn't invalidate trauma novel as a genre. What it means, though, is the fact that when you take trauma genre as a novel, and like I said, you shoehorn it where it doesn't really fit, you get a huge amount of dissonance with your fan base, and you get panels like ours that go on for an hour. So.
Right. And I think another aspect of it, because I think there's a couple of elements in play of the whole thing. I think one of the things is that you look at the memoir work in like Mouse or Persepolis, right? Where it's about personal experiences or personal experiences of close relatives going through traumatic world events. And so you get to look at the relationship of those things, right? And I think that can be really informative. I think there's an artistic value to that. I think it can shape the thinking of people reading it later on. But the question is does this trauma go through? Does it necessarily define the people that go through it? Is it an incontrovertible thing? And that's one of the things that I think that a lot of the trauma theory stuff that Larry has been reading to us, a lot of the thinking on that in terms of intersectionalism, it claims a necessity that direct or indirect traumas breed the same result. And I don't think that that's necessary. In observation of people, you guys know that in my job, I'm a mental health worker. I deal with people who've been through stuff. I don't, in the 20 years, almost 20 years I've been doing this, I don't see a necessity, a one-to-one ratio of this happens, so this happens to anyone. They like this happens, and you have this smorgasbord of options of things that I've seen, right? But there's not this happened to one person, so this happens to them or someone else. I don't see that as a one-to-one at all.
But we also have to look at going all the way back to Aristotle and the Poetics, how trauma has been typified through the Western media genre is being used. Trauma exists to purge and to purify the audience. You connect to the emotions of the main character, and the reason why the Greek characters were so much larger than life is because they were going to do things that brought out the deep-seated faults and flaws of a person and put them up large, and then you could be purged of those feelings in yourself because you could see the ultimate end of those feelings without doing those things.
Yeah, it's so you can experience some of those traumatic things on a smaller scale without having to go through them yourself and kind of purge those. It's catharsis.
Yeah, it's catharsis.
That you're trying to go for.
And that was actually Aristotle's definition of catharsis: is it's purging and purifying. I think it's in Poetics. But what happens is we've been trained to think that way about trauma, but what trauma theory does is it doesn't give us an end result. There's no resolution to the trauma. And that's why we're seeing a lot of traumatic characters in this new frame of literature who are either very cutesy, very inoffensive, and then immediately dark and violent on the other end.
And that kind of plays into, again, one of the problems with the power obsessed dynamic is the fact that it's an Ouroboros. It never ends.
Yep.
So what you end up getting is the fact that you have,
and that's kind of what I was trying to get at with looking at infinite regression, is that like if these things happen because of the environment, then you just go back and it's just the same thing. You're not there's no sense of progress to anything. So there can't be any, and if that's the way it has to be, then there's no moral weight to it.
So right. So
because like, what are you going to do? You're going to go change it? No, you can't change it because you're a product of your environment, and the environment's a product of you.
I think it's a little bit more than that, though, for them at least. Again, I'm not saying I ascribe to this.
But once again, I would think I would assume you're probably correct. Sorry, Dave got me off here. Go ahead, Twitless.
This time of day in this hemisphere. Yes. Can I see it? No.
I lost myself. I don't even remember what I was saying.
So we've turned the whole stream into steamed hams, except it's the Mattriarchy. Okay, yeah. So for those people where it gets
moral weight was the last thing I said before I stopped.
Where it gets really frustrating. And this, I think, also plays into some of the trauma theory and again, why it's never ending, right? And why you don't get a solution to it is the concept of solution is cited by some of these criticisms or critics as an operation of power and oppression, right? Because if you are not disabled, you are normative to an extent, which therefore means you are privileged, which therefore means we are operating on another axis of power and oppression. And
but if someone everybody's disabled, then the disabled are the ones with power.
Well, that would be an interesting world. But because that's not the way the power dynamic works, the criticism then focuses on, because for a time, the criticism was, and this is what's interesting, because some of these criticisms, I've been not studying a trauma theory exactly, but disability studies, I think, was something that I was doing some recent reading on for a seminar. And the discussion we had centered around this scholar was writing in the 90s. And we've evolved so much beyond the language that, kind of makes disabled people seem like they're not normative. And therefore, if they're not normative, there's something wrong with them. Whereas, they're actually, very, we shouldn't see them as not normative and not, try to oppress them. Their lives are, through their disability, is just as,
valid.
Right. Which, yes, they are. But at the same time, there's this sense that, like, you have to see ability and disability on a plane of equality that makes that kind of starts breaking your brain. It's like, well, I might be in a wheelchair, but that doesn't mean that I'm any, it creates
It's
this
about
very,
equality versus equity.
yeah, and it's this very, it creates these very strange situations where instead of, right, taking a look at Oracle and saying she is a hero despite her disability, right? And that's kind of the frame that you have in the, I think, 90s and 2000s. She's able to accomplish these things despite her disability. Go girl.
Which
Well,
is
and
again
I-
the
well, I don't think that's a complete rendering either.
Yeah, let me finish the
Okay,
thought here, right?
sorry.
So the shift through trauma theory is that it's wrong to see it that way. It's wrong to see it that you're a hero despite your disability. It's like you're a hero because of your disability.
Which, once again,
So
that's what I was going to get into, because that
so
actually is part of Oracle's story.
The axis is it shifts, and it makes it so that the disability itself becomes a kind of privileged thing according to that viewpoint, and it starts. Sorry,
which we then take a look. Pardon me. Go ahead.
Yeah, it creates a weird quagmire, because you can't. It makes it difficult in those circumstances to appropriately have the empathy that you're supposed to have. Hey,
I've got a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dominic Powell in the comments brings up a really cool thing about he's talking about that, you know, the events from traumatic things break someone, but they can be fixed. And I'm wondering what story or what writer has actually brought in a traumatic event for a hero, but then brought a resolve or fixed it, or not in like a campy way, but like what are some stories that even exemplify that?
See, that's part of the point of what I'm saying here is the fact that the concept of fixing someone is actually kind of offensive to some of these theories.
But let me give you an example of what you're asking for.
Okay.
When Frank Miller did the Daredevil run, where Kingpin found out who Matt Murdock was, and he killed Matt, quote unquote, blew up the law firm, drugged up his girlfriend with heroin, destroyed every aspect of Matt's life. And as Matt went through the whole process of dealing with all of that, he became a stronger person, ended up finding his mother and coming to terms with his relationship with her and being a stronger person out of that.
And this similar situation in Barbara Gordon, in what Ostrander in the pages of Suicide Squad and others did with rehabbing her after the trauma of the Killing Joke, where she dealt with the trauma emotionally, and then, not only despite, but because of the situation she was placed in, her inner character was allowed to flourish in a way that it didn't before. And so which is like, the whole, the cliche about the blind person who sees better and smells better. The whole Daredevil shtick is that because one avenue of expression, one avenue of action is taken, others can flourish. And so those are some examples, or two big ones. But I mean, even Batman's entire thing, right, is like that his personal trauma drove him to become a physical perfection, emotional control, discipline, the power of mind kind of stuff. But yeah, that's but I mean, I think one of the things that Twitless was talking about, the idea of fixing somebody, is offensive, and I would agree. Trying to do that to somebody else could be considered offensive, but for somebody else to fix themselves, I don't think that there's anything remotely wrong with that.
Again, it creates a very different perspective on especially like superhero works, and that's why you're getting so many of these characters where it's like, as opposed to this disability is something that I should fight or fix, it becomes like a defining trait that's like supposed to be celebrated in a way. And it's like, so obviously disabled people lives just as valid as anyone else, but the idea that your illness or disability should be celebrated is something that I find to be I find it to be kind of disturbing.
Well, and take a look at it from a different aspect, a different kind of trauma, right? Has anybody besides me read The Butcher by Mike Barron, the miniseries DC Comics did in the late 80s?
I have not.
Okay. The story is about a Native American CIA operative named John Butcher, and while he's off doing black ops for the U.S. government, somebody blows up his family. They want is that he's from Thunder Basin, in Wyoming.
Isn't Butcher the name of the guy in The Boys?
I don't know. I haven't read the
Yeah,
Boys.
yeah, it is.
But anyway, so while Butcher's off working for Uncle Sam, back home somebody decides they want his dad's land and just like blows up the gas station. It's a whole thing, and so it's a revenge story. The Butcher comes back after he gets, is able to leave the service, and he goes and hunts down the guys that are responsible. His whole mission is defined by, revenge. It's a story about him dealing with his trauma, right? But he's not defined by that. He's defined by the devotion that he feels, the duty he feels to honor his father's memory and to bring this person to justice, right? But it's not a thing that's celebrated. His trauma isn't celebrated. It's just a fact of his existence.
And that's a good point, because you'll notice that, and this is these theories. This is one of the reasons why when you take a look at in some of these critics, and you'll see it in their texts, and you'll also see it in their Twitter bios. But you'll see that they'll describe what's called their positionality, which is basically the same thing as a Twitter bio, and they'll say I am a, and they'll list all their identities. And again, by identities, they will list their sexuality, their race, their gender, and then they will, in many cases, they will list their disabilities if they have them. And so you'll get this list where it's like, I am a white, straight, or black, queer, gender neutral.
Wait, are you deciding? Are you trying to pick one?
I'm just giving you examples of the smorgasbord, right? But then they'll list, a part of that list can then include these traumas.
Celiac disease.
Yeah, exactly.
Colorblind.
The trauma and that's the thing that Rhys that you
My
just
grandfather was murdered over a land dispute. Oh wait, that happened to me.
But like the trauma is a defining part of their identity, so much so that when they list who they are, they will list that. And I would put to you that Spider-Man, as close to trauma as he is, would never say, "Hi, I'm Spider-Man. I am," and then I am, and then list the traumas as who he is. I think he would say that he is someone despite those things. He might say something. He might say I'm an orphan. He'd probably maybe say that, but or quasi orphan in a sense. But he would not say I am post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, Dominic, to your point, these superficial traits, they view things like the content of your characters, how you rationalize your ability to exist in the world with your trauma. It's to create the frame in which your trauma can be managed in the world.
And the thing that bothered...
And that gets also into things like social and emotional learning, which is a new hot buzzword topic, but that gets a little bit further down the road on this topic because it all intersects with all the postmodern Marxist thought that's hot in our culture today.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of it comes down, I think this is a I don't know, it's not even a theory. It's a hint, a suspicion, if you will. I suspect that the so much of this sort of thinking, this postmodern thinking, is a way to distract people is to dissuade the concept of agency and to distract people from the fact that they're being enslaved. They've elected their own. They've elected their own slave masters.
I would say, if you see the world in these power dynamics, what it allows you to do is to infinitely reframe anything in your life or society to leverage for power. Because you can, when you see all those articles about is air conditioning sexist? Is the way you hold your child racist? You're seeing constant.
That made me so mad. That
I remember
article.
the one,
yeah. And I'll tell you right now, the baby swaddling. Every culture in the world swaddled babies and carried babies in blankets. For thousands of years, the Welsh would use Foucault to carry their little infant pink Welsh babies around. And damn you for disgracing it by claiming that only one everybody has done this, because that's a great way to take care of a little baby who needs food. But
if we look at it from a pragmatic standpoint, and again, I do not agree with these standpoints, but if you look at it from their perspective, if they can constantly make you feel evil and guilty for everything, and then you can never be right. And if you can never be right, then that means, you're always wrong and they're always right. And they can then leverage that. In some cases, we see this from time to time where they straight up just come out and just demand the money that they want. You're wrong. You're evil for, all of these infinitely fractal reasons that will continue to fractal forever. And therefore, you must make recompense. And in order to do that, here's my Patreon, and you should just give me the cash. And some of them are actually starting to come out and start to just, say that. But that's kind of where some of this goes. You can leverage this infinitely for political, social, and in some case, just material power and benefit. So the people who see the world this way, or see that they can, leverage it, it's a very easy way for them to access those things, because of this is where I want to intersect our conversation on Ayn Rand, because Ayn Rand has some perfect encapsulations of why this works, why these theories and why they're so effective. But essentially,
I think that's a better term, that they're effective.
Yes, good point. Yeah, I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying
when you drill down, like I said, because once again, I mean, if it's an infinite regression back, and this is the only way things can be, because everyone through history has been a product of their environment, and that's not their fault. It's the people before them, but it all just goes back. Then there's only one way this could play out, and then there's no other option. This is the only way it could play out. I'm sorry, there is no privilege. It's simply the way it is.
Well, we can get into the fact that the person who invented the concept of privilege as a social science term didn't intend for it to ever be used this way, and the people who used it this way are deliberately using it contrary to original intent. And that's a strange thing to do to a strong black woman, but, you be you, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, I said that never matters. It never matters what
it never matters.
It never matters what a theory was intended for.
Yeah, because the thing is, and I think you're right about the idea about using this as a power lever, but the fact of the matter is who actually gets to pull the levers, right? And this comes back to
so the reason why you see if you ever have a chance to listen to some of these the people who are trying to pull the levers, if you because did you hear the there was a clip, I think your boy Zach played it, of I don't know if this was a comedic or not,
my boy,
but he it's just what he calls himself.
I know.
But
I'm just saying I don't pay attention to his content.
If I say Zach, no one might. But so Richard Meyer had I think he had a clip of the Union for Image Comics.
Yeah.
And it had a conversation with the people pulling levers, and one person said, "Can you please stop clapping, because I have a attention disorder and it's very distracting to me." And then someone else basically comes right off on his tail and says, "Can we stop using gender normative pronouns?" And what you see is a combat for who can pull the lever the most in terms of what they call in a joking term, the oppression Olympics, so that they can position themselves in the most oppressed terms.
Right, but say those aren't the real levers. These aren't people that are actually benefiting from the system, right? The people that are benefiting are still the politicians. They're still the people on top. They're still the people with letters behind their names. It's the same thing. So all of the people that think they're pulling levers, they're just convenient patsies for the same ruling class. And this comes back to full around with my thing is, I think all this stuff is distraction so that the kings can stay kings without anyone noticing it.
Well, this is a big thing, because things that happen in culture and society aren't simple, convenient things. They're very messy. This all goes back to a concept in social science and humanities called the crisis of modernity. Why did modernism lead to World War I and World War II? And that's where post-modernity emerged, with trying to come up with solutions to prevent the next World War I and World War II.
Okay, so
Or
I
at
guess
least,
you mean like because like I know because technically, I guess okay. So I hate those terms because you have modernity.
you hate the fact that modernity is in the past and it drives you insane.
No, because modernism was is often attributed to post World War One, and postmodernism is post that.
But if you think about what makes modernism with science and reason and this and that and the other thing,
yeah,
it led to both World War I and World War II. You can draw the through lines.
Right.
A lot of modern thought actually has its origins in the middle of the 18th century during the Industrial Revolution, the later part of the Industrial Revolution.
The problem is the
and
word.
those same kind of the ideas of the modern synthesis, and you've got Freud, and you've got Darwin, and you've got
problem is the term modern because like I said, modernism as a literary movement is very much post World War One. But modern as it applies to industrial society, definitely pre World War One. But then of course in today's day and age, modern, the Industrial Revolution is so old and archaic at this point. Calling it modern is kind of hilarious. And even postmodern, we're probably way past postmodern. We're post. So it's those terms are as they age. Some of them are not aging very well, and they're leaving.
When I was in college in the early 2000s, my professors were referring to things as post-modernity.
Mm-hmm. I think it's confusing.
Yeah.
I remember hearing the term postmodern, which is, like I said, confusing.
Though I think you can make an argument we're living in the crisis of post-modernity right now.
Yeah.
The other issue with a literary period is it's difficult to draw the lines until you're well past it.
Yeah.
Well, and that I think that's a big factor too, because the idea of when these thoughts emerged versus when they started impacting a culture, and once again, I'm going to go back and I think a lot of these ideas, especially the postmodern ones, are ones that have existed for millennia. They're not new. They're very old, and the in a lot of ways they're like feminism, right? The idea of especially second wave feminism is just clever guys to let men have all the sex that they can stand, and women think that they're owning their sexuality by giving away to sleazeballs. That's the bait and switch.
It's a little more than that, to be fair.
Well, I know.
Okay.
That's the point, man. If you couldn't design a better system to make that happen, then
listen. Viewing women as objects to be taken sexually is materialism, but also let me speak on secular materialism, and while all social interactions are materialist at their fundamental nature.
But anyway, my point though is that I think so much of this is it's a shell game, man.
Yeah.
I think a ton of it is just a shell game. It's just there to pull the wool over people's eyes by stuff.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, Nebel has a funny quote in chat. "You're ugly. You're disgusting. I'm going to kill you. Give me $200." I'm pretty sure I've seen that in a tweet before. In full earnestness. Isn't there this one, and it's got this there's a black woman,
a morbidly obese black woman who's doing a race sensitivity seminar,
and she basically says
white people are devils, pay me.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, it's white people are devils, pay me. So it's just basically that exact quote, just slightly.
In fairness, would anybody not want to pay somebody providing a viable service? Whatever it is, whatever your service is, if it's giving me value and I've got this cash, I'll gladly pay you. But so, I don't usually get paid to get yelled at, so that's not a valuable service to me. I'm not
when you work in customer service, that might
sketch
differ.
For crying out loud. What?
When you work in customer service, that might differ.
That's true. I don't. I work in human services. We expect a certain level of respect from the people we work with. So we give respect, we expect respect. It's congenial that way.
Let's circle this back to comics. Nick.
Back to comics.
Nick, how does this apply to comics?
Oh man.
Yeah, I'm going to totally put you on the spot.
No, I do have a question though. Is okay, so you're talking about the trauma theory, and I'm academically, I'm not sure I really understand where you guys are coming from. But I do have a question though. Is this the creator inserting this, or is this the audience perceiving it to be that way? How is this coming off?
My theory is that people like Tom King want to feel smart. So they hear about something in a literature class and they try to build their literary structure of their creation around it. That's my opinion of how this influence comes into comics.
Is it trying to be influential in that sort of way? Like, what's the point behind it?
He wants the audience to feel smart by reading something smart, and then they'll feel even smarter if they know what the smart thing is he's talking about.
So that's just Grant Morrison, what he does with his writing.
Yeah,
100%.
Yeah.
So
so here's the thing: is that there are tons of writers that follow this more current story theory, right? Do we think that it's still? I mean, because like comics have had for a long time, probably 40 years, this cloying, desperate, like pandering desire to be seen as legitimate, right?
Right.
And I'd like to point out that virtually for the entire time that's been happening, like sales have not been good. They've been getting progressively worse the more desperate people are to be
we took
seen
all
as
the fun
serious.
out.
I think so. But I mean, not entirely. It's not entirely true. It's not a one-to-one statement, but there's inclinations of that, and there are lots of factors. There is distribution. There's changes in the larger way business is done.
Well, yeah.
We don't go to the gas stations for ice cream cones anymore. Stuff like
I
that.
do, but it's usually by a guy standing off to the side, and it's a little shady. But he's nice. His name is Tom, and
Does he have black market comics to buy too?
So I would argue that it's probably I think it's a little bit of both. I think that there are writers who are deliberately, using some of these theories to create their comics. And then I think you've got fans or anti-fans in some cases who are bringing the interpretations to existing works where they don't necessarily fit. So you probably, I think, have a bit of mixture of both. Both ideas happening depending on the situation, because you can take these theories and you can read them into any particular work. That's one of the things that critical theory can in fact do. You can read them into anything, even if it doesn't fit.
And some of the thing that I find is so interesting about some of the stuff is it's accurate. I believe, based upon anecdotal, but based upon history and how we've looked at history and the things we've seen. There's some reality to it, right? The part of the reason that trauma exists is because these impactful, I mean, as a concept, is because these impactful events, right? They cause change into people, right? And if your grandfather was done dirty by the Smiths down the road, and you grew up hearing about how those guys were just dirt, then if you're in high school with Patti Smith, you may have a very negative opinion about her people just from what you've inherited from the opinions that your grandfather keeps spouting. So there are some ideas that do reflect a certain level of authenticity and reality with how that shakes out. And I think that once again, you're talking about trauma works, and Mouse, Persepolis are great examples of memoirs that specifically involve horrible, to different degrees, of course, but horrible things that people had to live through.
Joe Sacco's Palestine, by the way.
Yep.
Gotta shout out my boy Joe Sacco.
Also,
you guys are like this.
Also, another element to this is how glorified interns are now assistant editors on books, basically straight out of college. That's also probably playing a factor in how this influences what's being created now in the mainstream comics, and as well as TV and movies. That like these people are like, listen, I need you to read me a script or something to do this, and that's how they're influencing at the small scale level. And as Twitless pointed out, the anti-fans on places like Twitter.com, the evil bird internet that is the spawn of Satan, are being used by the big businesses to promote products as free advertising. So these people engage with these ideas, and it leads to really weird things about how the Joker's going to probably in 5 to 10 years be recontextualized as a queer icon, and he will then stop being a evil sociopathic villain and just be a misunderstood gay boy.
Yeah,
We
that's
were doing that for
already.
the clown in It. No, wait, no, that was someone else.
Right, but it's the same basic trend line.
Mhm.
And the Babadook is another one. The three evil clowns will all be, kind of dark prankster, bisexual,
So again,
ambiguous characters.
I got to tie this back to the dynamics of power, because the oppressed and oppressor, or the normative versus the queer. Queer does not necessarily always mean queer. Actually, doesn't really even mean a homosexual necessarily. It means just non-normative in many respects. Often regarding sexuality and your relationships with other people. But the fact that you have the majority in one category or range of or continuum of categories, and then you have the outliers, and then therefore they're oppressed. They're not normative, and because they're not normative, they will tend to be punished by society. And you just hear this narrative, and I'm parroting stuff that you've probably seen on Twitter 1,000 times. But take that outsider who's not normative, he doesn't conform, and society therefore has to punish him or her. And that's I'm basically just describing what people are seeing Joker as in general. And what this ends up creating for the consequences of this on the superhero narrative is it ends up creating what I would say a moral quagmire, where you do not have the straight and narrow lines between right and wrong. You end up with these very weird shades of moral ambiguity, where your superhero characters are acting in ways that, again, 10, 20 years ago, it would be like shocking, right? I think, again, I'm thinking back to another Richard Meyer video, but he was bringing up how Ms. Marvel, she's always Ms. Marvel to me, but Carol Danvers, and running a secret prison for people she didn't agree with. And it's like these behaviors are so far outside of what we would ever consider to be right or wrong. And yet people are writing these scripts and not even blinking.
Also, don't forget her child Gestapo. We can't forget the child Gestapo.
So the consequences of these theories is a continual watering down of the very straightforward traditional morality that these stories were built upon in many respects. And there's obviously, you can go to the golden age and find some weird examples of stuff. So I'm not saying it's always been exactly the same or consistent, but by and large, I would say that there was a consensus that emerged for the superhero story. And that consensus had very strong lines that were very, I would say, pretty acceptable for most of society regarding right and wrong. And what we're seeing now, like I said, is I think a lot of watering down of that.
And also related to that is we're going to use Jonathan Kent as the next example of what's going on. Jonathan Kent comes out as bisexual, but you're never going to see him have romantic feelings towards a female again. They're only acknowledging he clearly showed them in the past, so they can't say, no, that didn't happen. Just avert your gaze. And he
did it with Iceman.
which did to me, sort of a side note, to me, the Jonathan Kent thing is the creepiest thing imaginable. Because
you mean with the author insert as the boyfriend?
No, not with that. Because John Kent is 17, but he's 10.
Yeah. I
mean, he went from being 10 to being 17 just because.
And they don't address that.
It's time dilation through space, blah blah blah. Yeah. I get the science fiction of it, but for the reader's perspective, you didn't see him grow up. He's a pre. I don't even like to use this term, but pre-sexual, right?
Yeah.
In terms of how that works. I mean, like the sexuality of people is evident throughout their life in different ways, and it's not just about reproductiveness, but in terms of sexual maturity, that was before even as a factor. Like 10-year-old John Kent still thinks girls have cooties, and then you're saying, oh, okay, so now we're gonna age him up. We're gonna put him into a relationship with a chick from the Legion of Superheroes, and they'll do their thing for a little while, and then we're gonna go ahead and give him Lex Luthor's evil clone as a boyfriend, and we'll call it good.
Now, let me just get into the problem with this perspective as it comes to writing. So the character comes out as gay. That's your first thing. They come out as gay. They have their gay love interest. That's great. Second comic, they tell all their family and friends, hey, I'm gay / bisexual. And their family and friends say, well, that's wonderful, and we validate your life choices. And then they go to confront the villain. The villain is obviously opposed to it because they're the villain, and we can't write a villain who also is like, no, I'm okay with gay people.
I'm okay with gay people. I just don't like being stopped from destroying the world.
Isn't that kind of what they were doing? I'm not, again, I have not watched. I only saw the clip of Chucky pulling that, which again, they're like, oh, well, he's a monster, so he's trying to lure him into, I don't know what game they're playing, but
yeah, they're trying to play it both ways for the Chucky thing.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. So that's your first 3 stories. Realizes you're coming to a sexual awakening. Let everybody around you know. Your villains know. What's your 4th story? With, again, as we've discussed, the gay and bisexual. That's at the lead of your list of buttons that shows what your character are. Join your local dance youth.
Oh.
So takeaways. Let's see. I think somebody sent something in the private chat. Everybody. Oh, it's Twitless. He left.
Well, he left for a little bit, and then he came back.
I didn't even notice.
Surprise! It was so quick.
Look at that. But yeah. So yeah, I think that it's frustrating to me because trauma is I think it's a really important part of life. Not that people should go out and seek it, but that because it's an inevitable fact that people have to deal with. It seems like yet another thing that seems obvious to me, and I have yet to be dissuaded of this, that powerful people use to control people that think that they've become powerful, and that powerful people
the Bible,
use to exploit gullible people.
Yeah, the Bible has a great wisdom about trauma. King Solomon had a ring on it, and said, when times were great, he looked at it, and on the ring it said, "And this too shall pass." And whenever something terrible happens in his life, he should look down at the ring again and remember, and this too shall pass. Because all things pass.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And focusing on trauma is important. Focusing on being able to become fluent and literate and understand how trauma impacts your life is important. But you have to understand that, and this too shall pass.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's kind of the opposite of what some of the trauma theorists, because like I said, they want to kind of like stake that flag. This shall never pass. This is who I am. Is I think a chunk of what some of these theories represent.
Yeah,
so
I think
it's the opposite of this too shall pass. This is who I am specifically, and how dare you even try to suggest? It's oppressive to suggest that I should be anything different.
Yeah, which that reminds me of that line in that was in, I think, Avengers last year when She-Hulk was all Hulkified, and that they were, I can't remember the line from the page, but that Jennifer
was it one of the pages where it looked like the artist had a stroke drawing it?
Something like that. But I mean, the dialogue was something like that. The dialogue was something along the lines that that Jennifer was glad that she had was happy that she finally had the freedom to be ugly because she felt ugly. And that was actually, it was something like that was actually in the dialogue of the book.
Yeah.
and it seemed like it was directly pointed at the.
Can we bring back Byrne? Can we just dig him out of whatever?
And she said that to Deadpool, who not only has permanent cancer face, they also had sex. So Deadpool had sex with attractive She-Hulk. And Deadpool's gone through some things. And he realized she was going through some things. He was trying to be helpful to her, and she was very rude and aggressive and unpleasant to him.
Yeah.
Does anyone remember the tryst she had with Juggernaut?
Unfortunately.
No.
I do not. But
Okay.
we don't have to revisit that at this particular juncture.
Okay.
But the reason I bring up the She-Hulk thing is the idea, because the part of the thing I don't know. I think it was Jason Aaron was writing it, and I've not read anything of his that I've been fond enough to commit to a great deal of memory, right? But the whole thing, so my exposure to Ugly She-Hulk, to call it that, was specifically through through people sharing screenshots they took or photos they took of their comics, right? Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that during that entire phase of the story, she was grossly unhappy, right? And mm-hmm. that seems to be emblematic, if you will. People that want to define themselves by their trauma, not that they feel that, because like a certain amount of that is a fact of a person's life, right? Like I mentioned earlier, my grandfather was killed when I was 9 months old. He was killed over a land dispute in Wyoming, legitimately, and that was a tough part growing up, knowing that that's part of the family history. Mm-hmm. It also, getting old, it was sort of strange how stereotypical that was. It's like something out of a John Wayne movie, but it's my family's life. But that doesn't define me. It shaped part of my journey. But it's not the thing that defines who I am. It's just one facet of it. So for people who went through even more intensive traumas, more intensive things, because I wouldn't say that was a trauma for me. It's just a fact of my history, right? In the same way it was for my aunt and my dad and my uncle, who were alive when all that happened. For them, it was their father and it was their brother. Who were killed, and so that's a different sort of a thing. But point being, it's a fact of history, but it's not something to revel in, because reveling in it just makes a person miserable. Even though it's a grave injustice, mm-hmm. It still makes a person miserable. And for the way Jen was being written, it seems to me, and people who watch this, the 30 or 40 of you guys who'll go back and watch this, and I appreciate that. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression from the screenshots I've seen is that this is a time in Jen's life when she's miserable and wallowing, reveling in this misery. I don't understand. Part of my difficulty with looking at this as a literary theory that should be, or a political theory or an ideological theory that should be adhered to in the way that it's described so many times, is that we've seen, is that it's tailor-made to make a person miserable for themselves, and then seems to inflict that misery on others. And I don't understand why you would want to live in that space. For what? A little bit of power? I don't know.
Well, I mean, not just your personal power, but the desire to kill that guy who you think took the land from you, and repeat the cycle all over again.
There you go. That sounds like a real one.
That's how blood feuds happened, and how we spent centuries trying to not think that way.
I did some digging. Speaking of feuds, and completely germane to nothing, I did some. There's a relative. I forget which side of the Hatfields or McCoys he's on, but like he completely blows open like the whole like myth of the Hatfields and the McCoys. Like it's like everything you know is a lie. Here's all the documents to prove it. It was just like, oh wow, interesting. So
I mean, that goes back to the man who shot Liberty Valance. When the legend becomes the truth, print the legend.
So essentially, yeah, if you ever want to do some digging, look into the real story of that. There's some fascinating stuff. But
So
have we exhausted the trauma?
No, I think we've come to a good place. I think this seems
this is a good stopping point, because I mean, we could branch
point.
off into fractals
there's always
of dark postmodernism, but we've done enough.
Here, Mrs. H has a neat little comment. If you focus on the trauma that you've endured enough, you get to the point that you wholeheartedly believe that you're a victim and not a perpetrator. And I think to clarify that you cannot be a perpetrator because you can only be a victim. And right. I think we see that happen all the time. In the modern world, I think that people really, really lean into that in a way that it's a fact that hurt people, but not everybody who is hurt hurts people.
Drawn talks trolling. Let your trauma fuel you. Let it be your identity. Let's go find and kill that family and avenge your grandfather.
They're also my family.
Yeah, there goes the CIA to track us all down. Thank you, Tyler. We're sending them to your house first.
No, we're not going to do that.
No, we're not going to do that. No. But I remember I was watching this video with Alan Moore on it where he said people believe in conspiracy theories, and this whole Marxist power dynamic is a conspiracy theory because it's comforting. Because the truth is, the world is completely rudderless. No one's at the wheel. Things just happen because they happen.
Well, that's silly. Because I was just talking, I'm going to name drop. I was just talking to Doug Ernst the other day, and we were chatting about this kind of thing, about conspiracy theories. And one thing I said to him, I said, the thing is, a plan doesn't, an agenda doesn't have to have a central operating control to be an agenda. Mm-hmm. If enough people who are solo agents think the same way, the same thoughts at the same times, then they perform the same actions without anybody directing them.
I mean, that's a standalone complex, as we learned from Ghost in the Shell.
I like that callback.
Okay, and that's set. Okay, shilling time. We're gonna go. We'll leave it with the anime reference and move on to the shilling. What do people want to talk about?
I think Nick should go first.
Oh, okay, sure. Let's talk about trauma and then just throw it right at me. That's
You had the trauma of having to listen to all of this.
I have trauma from this stream now.
I'm sorry, Nick.
Myself to that. No.
I'm sorry, Nick. Man up a little.
I can't.
Okay. You can just have some of that tomato sauce.
What am I supposed to talk about now? The traumatic effects of.
No. What books are you working on, man? What do you want people to? What have your?
Well, I don't know if anyone knows this, but
Tyler's got your back. Nick has the most trauma, so go buy his stuff.
Yes, yeah. We did a whole book about it.
You has more trauma, gets the money.
I need therapy sessions.
Is this where we get to pull out our stack and talk about how depressed we are?
Yes,
I am currently the most depressed out of all of you.
No, actually, I think this is the fun part because since we're on your stream, we get to talk about Saint Nick and how awesome Matthew Rhys wrote this awesome demon hunting version of Santa Claus, or the actual original Saint Nick. I don't know if I can sell it as well as you because you're a little bit more in depth in terms of the historical knowledge of it, and I just like the concept and the idea behind it. But we're doing pre-orders for right now. Words, trauma. We're doing pre-orders right now for this book. And it's part of our ongoing series of Demon Hunters and our History of the Demon Hunters catalog.
Nice.
It follows the original actual Saint Nick back in, Matt, is it 300 AD? Is that?
Yeah. In the late 2nd century, during the before the Council of Nicaea.
Right.
And so we have a framing sequence that sets up Council of Nicaea. For those of you who don't know, the Council of Nicaea was like the third or fourth ecumenical council that heavily discussed the nature of the divinity of Christ as a member of the Trinity, and goes into that, and the story. And that part's the first part is genuinely historically accurate. The second part is a legend that has some basis in it, but may not be 100%. The legend goes is that during the debate, Arius, who was a heretic, who said that,
Go ahead.
said that well, I mean, that was one of the determinations of the council, was that Christ was not divine in the same way, was not of the same nature as God. So in the middle of his speech, he starts singing mocking songs that he had written, and so Nicholas gets up from the back and walks to the front and punches him clean across the mouth. At which point, Nick was defrocked, and his bishopric was taken away from him, and then he go on to be a lay minister till his death. So,
in our version, he hunted more demons.
Yeah. So that's the legend. And so what we did is we set up a story from before the council explaining motivations and reasons behind Saint Nick's passion. So
it's a really heartfelt story.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty pleased with it. So yeah, I hope people will dig it and check it out. And
I got to send you the lettered version tonight. I just got it done yesterday.
Cool.
Nice.
Matt has a lot of people here. You guys hear his academic sort of sound to things and his incredible intellect, but very few know of his absolute magnificent writing skills. And I can't speak enough to it. There's a part in this book that it hits you emotionally. I don't want to give it away because it draws attention towards a very sort of atrocious act, and it was definitely a challenge to depict it and draw attention to it. And that's one of the fun things with working with you guys is how you guys can set up vulnerable situations in your writing. And so for me, it just brings about something very pivotal for the readers to come at. So I'm really excited for people to read this. There's been a lot of interest. We're doing something kind of out of the bounds. We're not going to crowdfunding with this one because we just did Sunchild, and we're just going straight to pre-orders with this. So we're doing direct market sales, which is always risky because you don't know how people are going to respond. So been very happy that people have been responding and coming in and ordering. We got a healthy order coming in. So get your orders in. We're hoping to get these out before Christmas. Cutoff to get your orders in is by the end of November.
And that's that's on your what is it?
Gumroad site. Yeah, you can go to
store.
BMR Comics, go straight to the merch part of it. And you can look at all our stuff. We also have a Black Friday week-long sale going on next week. So if you missed out on any of the current publications that we have going on, you can get caught up and join in on the current Divine Anomaly ongoing series and stories that we have going on. Discounts and codes and everything. So keep an eye on social media, newsletters and such as that. We'll be giving out codes and 20% discounts as well. That's all I got.
All right.
Okay. And hang on just a second. Oh, come on. What the heck? I'm going to drop that in the chat. Look at that.
Buy my stuff.
Oh, that's not what I want. What the heck? Okay. Sorry.
I also have 5 kids to feed, so if you could buy more products, that'd be great because there's a lot of trauma in our house from me having to feed 5 kids. So a lot of screaming, a lot of babies crying. It's very. There we go.
There we go.
There's the link.
Now there's the link in there. So, Larry, what you been up to, man?
So, Wild Tales of Kyrie is going out to readers. I have my physical copy. I'm sure some people have already received theirs. Digital copies have gone out to some people already. And in the back of that, there's a teaser for Matt, my next project. Not this Matt, but the other Matt. Solid State.
What is that?
So, not to give away too much because we don't want to give away too much at this stage. I took the basic idea behind Joss Whedon's Dollhouse and removed all of the creepy and disturbing Joss Whedon elements from it, and
But that's the
incorporated.
entire show.
It's actually not. And I then in turn took Jason Bourne elements in there and spliced it together and made my own story off of it. And we have 3 scripts, and we have a couple of artists we're working on tryouts right now, and that's in development. But if you get your Wild Tales of Kyrie, the teaser image for the future is in there.
And as an added bonus, if you pick up Wild Tales of Kyrie, you can also get a story co-plotted by me.
Yes.
Yeah, Matt said that I'm credited as the co-writer, but that is not true. I'm really helped with the plot and the page layouts. That's it. So, there you go. But yeah, it's there. There's a link. You check it out. And Twitless, of course.
We're on Amazon Kindle now. Check out The Adventures of Omega Girl, issue 1, and check out my webcomic, superschool.com. I should probably put a link to some of this stuff, shouldn't I?
You could. You definitely could.
Yeah, give me a second. I have mod power. I can do this.
I think there is a link to your Amazon store in the description of the video.
Oh, is it? Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is my love letter to classic superhero comics. And if any of you ever played City of Heroes growing up, there's a little bit of inspiration from that as well. Come join the adventure as Amanda Shields fights the forces of Jackal in a sci-fi utopian setting, or quasi-utopian setting. Supposedly, I could go down this road for a while. It's supposed to be a sci-fi paradise, but it is plagued by evil. There we go.
You know, like love potion wielding supervillains.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love it.
I'm glad somebody's enjoying themselves. Just dramatic for me.
we just Twitless and I just send each other stories all the time.
Yeah, it's quite fun. And
when's the second issue coming out?
Oh, I have it, like, I have the proof copy with me. I just I've been so busy lately. The second issue should be out very. Yeah, I know, right? My second issue should be out very shortly. I have it like already, and I'm already working on the third, so it's coming.
Because we still need to talk.
I do. I definitely want to, have those conversations. Definitely, looking forward to it.
Good.
Anybody, let me know if you want to do some Easter eggs with Omega Girl. I'm very open to that sort of thing. We have an Easter egg from Raven showing up, I think, in our third issue. From what was Rhys? What was the story? It was Witch. Lazy Witch.
Machi the Lazy Witch.
Yeah, Machi Lazy Witch. Yeah. She shows. We have a nod.
Raven Monroe.
We have a nod to her showing up in a future issue.
Since Evie just got here, if you go down to the description, you can follow the link to her store and get some original art from her. So you should do that too, because she's been kind enough to donate some of her stellar, iconic art to our pages, and as well as putting together the fun intro we used. So there you go.
Nice.
Definitely.
And if you're looking for something free to read, you can always check out forcesgoodandevil.net, and you can get almost 700 pages of comedy and teen angst and superpowers in high school. Or you can check out Webtoon. There's some of it's in color there too.
You can check it out in color.
Yeah. Some of the art's been tweaked on the Webtoon version too, so. And I'm still working on it, but it's it's really slow. Apparently, I don't do things quickly. There you have it.
Since I am a boomer, I don't know how to get the image to you guys via the actual StreamYard's interface, but I just posted it on Twitter.
Oh, cool.
So if you want to extract that teaser image from the Twitter.
Let's see what I can do really quick.
The heck's a Twitter?
I got you. I got it, Rhys.
Sounds like a
I mean,
Actually,
Twitter
hold on.
is
I need to-
bird internet, which is
Just-
something that should be
yeah.
incorporated as a domain of Satan.
I could jive with that.
Yeah, nice. Looks nice.
Is it this might be a little bit ironic, but I'm getting like a La Femme Nikita vibes coming off of this thing.
I mean, the fact that it's a redhead contrasts with a brutalist Eastern European styled city.
That's part of it, and also the Russian letters in the back.
Well, yeah, that's because it's an Eastern European city, and we wanted the Russian letters there that don't actually say anything valid in Cyrillic script, but
Yeah.
and you notice the iconic K-bar knife down there.
Yeah. Well,
Nice.
and the other part of it, why that's in the front of my mind, is that Matt Krotz has been like somebody made an off reference to La Femme Nikita on one of his posts he put on there,
Yes.
and he's just been on a tear this week, been looking up all sorts of stuff and reading about it, and I'm like,
Yeah.
and he's like, "What is this?" And I said, I think I put on Twitter, I can't remember if I replied this or not. I said, "You clearly were not a teenager in 1994, huh?"
He was not. But he's been learning about the spy genre, and also one of the things that inspired me with this character in the story I wrote was The Long Kiss Goodnight, a excellent movie with Gina Davis, and Samuel L. Jackson was funny and entertaining in it.
Mm-hmm. It was before there was too much Sam Jackson oversaturation.
Yep.
So he's coming pretty much right off the heels of Pulp Fiction. The fun thing about Long Kiss Goodnight, if you enjoyed Long Kiss Goodnight, Larry, have you checked out the Silencer that DC Comics had out a couple years ago?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
man.
I did.
Was that good stuff or what?
That was good stuff.
Oh man, the fact that didn't get marketed better. That is a crime. That's what that is.
Yeah.
That's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an amazing series.
And the character you see in the scene, at least in the script, I've named Baltimore as an homage to that character. And I was able to do that because I found out that the Alpha, Tango, Sierra, Echo, those things in the NATO standard references for letters was not the original version of that, and there was an earlier version, and I found one with Baltimore, and I said, I'm going to yoink this and take this.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, okay, guys, that seems like a really good place to break. So we're going to call it a show. Thank you guys for tuning in. It's a slightly extra long. It's the same length as the old show used to be. We just kept talking and talking. I didn't have to go anywhere. It was nice.
Yeah.
So, guys, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for coming on the panel. And next week, I have forgotten we have on next week.
Are we doing a CC again?
I think that's what we had planned, right? But we haven't communicated that very well. Well, next week we're supposed to have another Comics Creators Club, but we'll have
it's
to see how that
Thanksgiving week.
shakes out.
Are you doing a show next week?
Yeah, we were going to on Wednesday night.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, night before Thanksgiving. But yeah, so it's supposed. I mean, the plan, but the month got away from me. We were going to be looking at Marmaduke's comic Jane Wannabe Gladiator and some Curie, but I don't know that Matt Krotz was going to bring some Curie, but I don't know if he shared it at all.
I mean, Matt can certainly share it, I suppose.
Yeah,
we still have time. We still have time.
We can get it. People can probably read
that.
Yeah, but if I could tag along, in that would be fun too.
So, well, we'll see. We'll have to see, because I know we'd love to have you on at some point.
Yeah,
but I'm not sure. Wednesday night.
This was a fun dissertation.
You should read. I definitely see a conference paper.
Yeah. Oh man, it's crazy. Okay, we're gonna hit the end broadcast button. Tune in next week for who knows what for sure. Man, what happened to this month, Twitless?
I don't know.
Good night, kids.
All right, take care.